Hello, my name's Cliff Freilich. I'm the Executive Director of Cinema St. Louis, and we're the presenters of the 29th Annual Whitaker St. Louis International Film Festival. We are absolutely delighted to have with us the co-directors of 9 to 5, The Story of a Movement, Julia Reichert and Steven Bognar. We'll call him Steve. And we are going to have as our interviewer the wonderful documentarian AJ Schnack, who actually is, of course, hailing from the St. Louis area, Edwardsville native, and has collaborated in the past with both of you. So I'm going to now exit and turn over this conversation to AJ.
Thank you, Cliff. Great to see both of you. This is the first time we've seen each other in a little while, even though it's on the computer. So it's great to see Steve and Julia. For those of you who aren't familiar with their body of work, Julia is, we call her the godmother of American documentary. She has been not only a prolific filmmaker, but also a wonderful teacher of both students and just generally to those of us within the documentary world. She's been a great source of inspiration and knowledge. She has been nominated 4 times for the Academy Award, which is pretty remarkable in documentary, for 2 of her first films, Union Maids and Seeing Red. And then with Steve, they were nominated in the the nonfiction short category, documentary short category for The Last Truck. And then, of course, they won the Oscar earlier this year. So great for American Factory. They also won the Primetime Emmy for Lion in the House, which is an extraordinary film. And when I first met them now,
right,
over 12 years ago, which feels crazy. But
and
we're here. Go ahead.
We met you. That's literally how we met you, because we found out about that, or we found out about something like that through you.
Well, you
were the Spirit Awards,
the Spirit Awards. You were nominated for a Spirit Award. We were nominated for a Spirit Award, and you came right up to us and said something like, "Hi, you don't know me, but you just got nominated for a Spirit Award." And you were with David Wilson, and you guys looked so young, and you were so like exuberant. And we were like, "These guys are high. Who are these guys?"
Well, we were in Amsterdam, so we could very well have been high.
Yeah. But you're very charming.
Yeah, well, it's amazing to believe that it's been that long. Of course, I've had the great opportunity to work with both of you, which has been a real thrill. The new film is great, 9 to 5, Story of a Movement. That's the one we're talking about today, and that hopefully people have just watched. I believe that's how this works. I don't know, actually, but I think that's how it works. So let's talk about that, and then we'll talk a little bit more broadly. I mean, 9 to 5 is obviously, it deals with labor and work and women, and these are subjects that have been a big part of both of your body of work in the past. And I was thinking about the fact that a lot of us make films about professions, where whether it's about journalism or politics or medical or teachers or whatever, but not that many people make films about the act of work and labor and what that means and the relationship between labor and management. Julia, maybe you can start, but what drew you to that as a subject, and what continues to draw you to it, all these years later?
That's a great question. I think a lot of the films I've worked on or made, and a lot of people, you included, the ideas, the subjects come out of your own life, right? There's things you're struggling with, or you're questioning, or you feel is overlooked, and you want to get it up there. That's been true for me with all the films. So, so I'm a woman, and I came of age before the women's movement. So we knew we had to do something about the fact that all the people we ever saw on screen who wrote articles about us, whatever, we're all men, we're all white men. We had to deal with that. I'm also from a working class background. And for sure, there were not stories of working class people. In fact, I was ashamed to be a working class person. That's how, when I went to college, I didn't talk about it. I lied about it, actually. So I think I had once that key was unlocked through the women's movement, right, that we could pick up cameras and we could pick up sound gear and make our own films, that was the unlocking. that then it got to be, you know, class and race, and not only women. Although I think I don't know, I guess it comes out of, you know, wanting to put my own history in a way, or my own forebears, let's say, on the screen, right? And feeling like class is a very highly active, motivating force in American culture, society, economics, and it's just underground. Like, people don't talk about it. Maybe more now, actually.
But you've been talking about it for a while.
Yeah.
You know,
right.
I mean, I feel like this film really emphasizes the through line in Julia's work across decades, because you made Union Maids, which when Julia was like in her early 30s in the 1970s, she looked back at the young activists of the 1930s who were saying women should have unions. You know, women who work in factories should be in unions. And you found those women and you told their stories beautifully. And here you are now telling a story of not antecedents, but like your contemporaries,
my generation,
who were also like young women who knew they had a bad deal, right? They had a really unjust work environment, and they did something about it. And now you're telling their story. But the twist is that you're their contemporary.
I know. I'm so inspired by social movements, you know, people deciding to band together to kick butt about their grievances, you know, and we're seeing that now. You know, little did we know when we started the film that there would be anything like this now. You know, I don't know if you know, AJ, but we started this film way before we started American Factory, like several years before.
And before Me Too and Time's Up, all that.
You know, that was nothing we ever knew about. In fact, it was a time when feminism and being called a feminist was like, even on campuses, was kind of a negative. Anyway, and the you know, American Factory and The Last Truck and Union, they all kind of talk to each other. Mm-hmm. You know, especially if you think about American Factory and this film. We could talk more about that if you want, but there's a lot of the same currents in both films. Dignity on the job, respect on the job, a living wage. Should we organize unions? You know, what does it mean to fight for a union? What are unions? You know, like, in a way, making 9 to 5, it was kind of relief to be able to just say right out there. You've seen the film, I imagine, like, we can talk out front about what we believe.
When you know, oh, go ahead. But no, I was just going to say, like, when you're making these films, I think one of the things that's really interesting is that while the sort of central notion of labor is there, one of the great things as a filmmaker, I'm sure, is that you also see that touches on so many other things outside of just that relationship between labor and management. You mentioned class. You've talked about specifically the relation, you know, how women have been treated specifically within, you know, employment over time. You know, I think that's one of the interesting things about both this film and, you know, American Factory, was that you're able to get into like a lot of other stories and ideas by starting with this idea of, okay, well, we're telling us, you know, this labor, what is it like to be in this job at this time?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
And it but then as soon as you start digging into that, you're grappling with the fact that, like, even though this was like a group of secretaries across the country, it's not a monolith. And that if you're white, or if you're black, or if you're Latina, you know, it's going to be different. You're going to have different situations based on your ethnicity, your race, you know. So it's not, even that starts digging into other territory.
But, you know, you said, what got me interested? And I said, well, the women's movement got me started, you know, back in 69, 70. It was so delightful with 9 to 5 to make a movie where all the speaking parts are women.
All the contemporary speaking parts
who are interviewed in the film are all women. The only people who are men are the generally kind of jerks who provide a little bit of humor for today's audiences, you know,
in
from
the
the past,
archival material.
in the archival. But
Yeah.
I just love.
Some of that archival is crazy. When the bosses are ID'd as being the worst boss, but they come up with I forget the better name that they have for it, but it's such when the bosses are like owning being like terrible bosses and putting their arms around their secretaries, like, I've got my girls here. That's
right, exactly. You just see how permeated it was in the culture, how bedrock. That particular image you're mentioning, where the boss puts his arm around his secretary and pulls her close. When I saw that archival footage, it just tingled my whole body. It was like, that is what it was like. Mm-hmm. And the way her face looks, she's sort of smiling like, oh, I've got to cuddle up to you. But then you see her face drop. It happens quickly, but you see her pull away and her face look down, and it's almost like if you asked her at that moment, what are you feeling? I don't think she could have articulated it. Mm-hmm. I don't think I could have, but I would have had that feeling of like, I got to smile. Oh, this doesn't feel right. Oh, I got to smile. Oh, this doesn't feel right. And which is correct. And that's why we made that into a very slow motion. I don't know if it struck you that way, like that you kind of got what she was going through.
Yeah, no, I did. I got that. And also just, you know, the fact that he was in that moment thinking like, this isn't necessarily a bad thing for me. Like I should own being like a bad boss, you know, because that's like, you know, I'm tough. It really spoke in both of them. I thought it was such a moment in time that was true. I mean, it was true and it was widespread.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, well, that wasn't so bad. I only asked her to sew up my pants once.
Yeah. Well, or like the guy who goes on the Phil Donahue show because he's asking his secretary to page him if she sees an attractive woman at the beef and beer restaurant. You know, it's like the nerve, the arrogance, the inherent arrogance of that is just remarkable. That he's like happy to sit there on TV and say, yeah, that's what I do. That's who I am.
Well, people think we haven't come a long way. We have come a long way. We have a ways to go. There's not equality, you know, at the workplace. There's not equal pay. There's still definitely sexual harassment. You know, but you wouldn't get away with those kind of things anymore. And the men, probably younger bosses, probably wouldn't think to ask that. I hope. Anyway. So anyway.
Yeah.
Don't let that to do horrible things.
Right.
You know, access is always such a big thing, and you guys in getting Karen Nussbaum and Ellen Cassidy, was that something? When did that start? You talked about how long it took. Maybe you can, for those people who don't make docs, like just the process and how, you know, the chronology of when you started. This isn't, you know, there's an Ohio piece to this story, a big Ohio piece, so it's in your backyard. How did it all come together, and when did you start?
Well, real quick, it didn't start in Ohio at all. You may remember, we moved to Washington, D.C. to take care of our first grandchild for a year. And Karen lives in D.C. Karen was kind of a vague old friend from back in the day. And so we had dinner one night. And we were just talking, all three of us. And we got talking about the working women's movement and 9 to 5. And, you know, it kind of came up like, wouldn't that be a good subject for a film? And right?
Well, and then we realized no one had done this. It was a story that was largely forgotten. Julia knew about it from the 70s. I didn't know anything about it, but it immediately, we went home and we're like, this is a story that hasn't been told. Mm-hmm. But then you ask yourself questions as a filmmaker. You're like, well, how many of the protagonists are still around? And is there archival footage? That becomes a really important question. Are there either within the closets of the women themselves, or at local TV stations, or at newspapers, where can we find archival material that will bring the story to life? And so we were very intrigued, but we didn't know immediately what we could find, you know, for a while.
And there was no book, AJ. There was not a book that we could base. There were no articles. There were no studies. Basically, there was very little that you could find. But Karen, we met a couple of other of the originals. We met Debbie Schneider and Kim Cook, who were in the film. They were in Washington, and we liked them a lot.
Yeah.
Right. And it kind of like, we kind of tumbled into it. We also thought, as filmmakers naively do, oh, we'll make like a half-hour film. It'll probably take about a year. You remember all those thoughts.
Oh, yeah.
And so that was in like 2010, 11?
11, 12, something like
Yeah,
that.
something like that. And with an archival film, you can like, do a bunch of research, find all the people in Boston, go to Boston, interview them in a long weekend, come back home, transcribe. It's a kind of a methodical process that you can do over a few years. And we were really enjoying it. And I mean, a lot of things changed. Like one thing, we became really aware that we needed to delve more into was how they dealt with race, 9 to 5, as a women's labor movement, as an intersection between the women's movement and the labor movement, neither of which were doing a great job of dealing with race. But these guys sort of did. So they
eventually, they had a lot of,
first,
I mean, you
right.
see it in the film, it was founded by white women who were approaching it from a white woman's perspective. And not that they were like upper middle class or anything, but they were struggling to figure out the way, and they made mistakes along the way. Definitely.
Yeah. So anyway, somewhere like 3-4 years into the process, we found out that there was this factory reopening that we had made a film about. The last truck,
American factory, yeah.
the last truck closing of a GM plant, right? That the plant was going to reopen, and by God, it's a Chinese owner. And we kind of got drawn into that. And then 4 years go by, and 9 to 5, we kept working on it, but it got more and more into the back burner, really.
Yeah. Well, we also ran into another big challenge, which was the more, one person leads you to the next. And we met all these women. We ultimately did something like 35 interviews.
Mm-hmm.
And
on film,
on sit down, well lit, multi-hour, like all half a day. And we just fell in love with all these characters. Their stories were so good. But it's like there's chapter in Atlanta, there's chapter in Seattle, there's a chapter in Ohio, in Cleveland, there's a chapter in Boston. And you've got multiple quote unquote characters in each city, and battles and anecdotes and stories. How does this all become one movie? Now, we're big believers in multi-character movies. I mean, if you watch American Factory or The Last Truck or whatever,
Lion, or
there's no one
Red,
protagonist.
Yeah.
We don't
do that.
The one protagonist kind of movie, that's fine if it's a good
Mm-hmm.
story. But we feel like real change happens when people work as a collective, as a movement, and we love telling stories of movements. Mm-hmm. But narratively, it becomes a big knot to untie, because you've got all these different shifting perspectives, shifting characters, locations, all that stuff. Yeah. So that was tough.
It was actually an extremely difficult film to edit.
Yeah.
I even compared to like American Factory or The Last Truck and Lion.
Mm-hmm.
Lion was pretty difficult too. But anyway, I'm very proud of the film now, and I hope that it goes into the hands of young activists today. So that, because we actually edited it thinking about tactics and strategy, things they tried where they failed, and they tried again, as opposed to like a heroic movement story. They stumble and they get attacked. And
those are important to tell.
And the fact that they use humor, they thought of tactics and strategies that would fit with their constituency. And if you didn't think of yourself as a feminist, that was okay. There wasn't like a litmus test that you had to pass in order to be in that movement.
Yeah, no, and I was thinking, about I grew up at a certain time when the film version, the Dolly, Lily, Jane film, that was a cultural moment, but it felt like, movies that I had grown up with, like the kind of I mean, this is going to sound weird, but it sort of felt like Disney movies. And it wasn't just because of the animated sequences when they try to get rid of Dabney Coleman, but there was a kind of a broad comedy mixed with, story. And it's amazing. I liked in the film how you showed that the film was both, how the feature film, the narrative feature, a Hollywood feature, I guess we should say, became both a great, sort of spotlight on the movement, but then also, presented its own set of challenges ultimately. Which that's I have to admit that I obviously have seen the Hollywood film and was not as aware of the movement. I'm sure that's where a lot of people come from, and certainly didn't understand how, that there were some things about the Hollywood film that weren't necessarily great for the movement.
Let's see. I'm not sure how to respond to that. Let's see.
Well, they loved the movie. The movement loved the movie because it really helped put it on the map in a very big way. And then they used that as a catapult to try to actually form a union of secretaries, and as we hear in the movie, it's like they did that right as Reagan was coming into office, and it was a collision of terrible timing.
That was the time of the when we have the president of the United States suppressing a labor union, like openly, which opens the doors for like whoever in the capitalist class, like, well, the president says it's okay.
Right. Air traffic controllers and
all that stuff.
It's a big chapter in American history that I think a lot of people don't know, but it was pivotal anyway, honey.
I think the Hollywood satire, the classic, was so useful to the movement because suddenly it was the name recognition, and they did try to leverage that as well as they could. And Jane would travel with the movie. She went out to cities all over, being the activist that she is, which was great. So they really loved the movie in a big way.
Yeah, and people saw it. I remember when it came out, secretaries saw it 3 and 4 times because it was their life up there on the screen, right?
Yeah.
And you hadn't seen it, like you said in the beginning, it's interesting. I don't know why probably because AJ, we know you so well that I feel like we're just sitting across the table talking here. But Steve and I, as filmmakers, we don't have to go into too much detail about it, but we had pretty different perspectives on what this film should be, right? And in the end, that might be a little bit why it took a really long time. I'm really glad how it worked out, but I wanted it to be a tool for activists. I didn't care if it ever went to a film festival, whatever. I wanted it to be something to place in the hands of young activists and go through all the tactics and explain all about unions and you see now how the union, like, what is a union? We found a funny way to do it, and I love it. Now, Steve, I would say in my words, wanted this and believed it could be like a popular film, a funny film, a film that was cinematic. He didn't want it to just be a tool for activists, but I felt like if we made it this popular film, we'd lose the kind of activist content that I wanted.
Like we'd water it down too much?
Yeah, like it wouldn't be there.
Or simplify.
Is that how you would say it?
Well, I always felt it was a funny, entertaining film that could also be a political film. I just had this, based on the content, what the screen talking back at you. We also had a great editor, Jamie Meyer-Schlenk, who has a fine-tuned sense of comedy. Mm-hmm. And, she would weigh in and say, I think this film could be very entertaining, but it's the wonkiness, the potential wonkiness, the deep dives into things like unions and how they work. That was always a stumbling block. There's so many cuts of this movie where you fall off the narrative train, the momentum, the train hits a log, and
when you hit unions
or a few other places, and you just realize we have to simplify, but not lose the heart of what we're trying to say. And that took forever, took forever.
Well, since you brought up like the ways of working together, I am curious about that. I mean, it's sort of famous that Penny Baker and Chris Hedges, they would say like, they get married in the production and divorced in the edit. And I feel like Shirley, my wife, and I sometimes we have a similar experience when we're like going through it. And it's hard. I think, it's hard when the person who you're, most connected to, if you don't feel like you're on the same wavelength about the creative material with them, it's worse than like just another producer who you may trust or an editor you may trust. When the person you're, with is like, we're going in the wrong direction, and you felt like you solved something, and then they're like, no, not only didn't you solve it, it's worse.
Yeah, we've had that many times, many times, where one of us is sure they figured something out, and the other person's like, no,
you're totally wrong. How could you even think that?
What are you thinking? Right. Oh my God. Yeah.
You have to have certain rules about couplehood and filmmakerhood, or whatever, co-filmmakerhood.
Yeah.
There were periods, I don't know if I ever told you this, honey, when I was sort of like so fed up with this whole discussion of it's got to be a popular film, we got to try for film festivals and blah, 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 that I was almost like, okay, forget it. I'm the director of this movie. You're not. You're the cinematographer. Just let me have it. And I'm sure, what would you have said?
I would have said, honey, don't give up on me. I don't know. I would have said, don't do that. You know, I mean, the luxury we have is our independence gives us time, right? We didn't have a deadline.
No.
And that is crucial, because
it wasn't this is airing in June. You need to have it right.
Exactly. So these problems sort themselves out. I would say two things. One is because we both live with the cut, and then you walk away from it for a few weeks. You come back and you're like, oh, you know what? Julia was right about that. The other thing is we do a lot of test screenings.
Yes.
A lot. With this film, we did probably 15.
Oh my God.
15 test screenings with audiences anywhere from as small as 6 people to as many as like 30 people.
Well, no, we had a couple that were in like
then
in the hundreds.
No. So then Julia was, because Julia was celebrating her 50th year as a filmmaker, there was a retrospective that the Wexner Center curated that started at MoMA. We did a test screening of this film at the Museum of Modern Art. It was their first ever test screening.
They were a little freaked out.
And there was like 150 people there. We showed it as a test screening at full frame, and there were nearly 300 people.
It was over 300.
Oh, okay.
It's almost 400.
So, you really start to feel how the movie's working, and that helps us resolve some of these like disagreements too, because the audience tells you,
Yeah. And anyway, it was.
And we were lucky for that.
It was really shocking how, whatever audience, if there were younger people present, like I'm talking about under 35, they just had no clue what the word union meant.
Yeah, that's sad.
And it was very sad. Unless their mom or dad happened to have been in a union, then they might have some idea and that they were positive. But people would say, unions, oh, those are corrupt, right? Just like the automatic response. I don't know, they're just bad, they're corrupt, you don't want to be in one. So we sort of knew that was going to be a big challenge. And it really wasn't until when we brought, we used to have people talking about what a union is. We tried different, and it was always a total buzzkill when we got to that section of the film. But then we brought our graphics person on board, Paula Kinsel, and really great.
She did great work.
And she did all those graphics in the last like 6 or 8 months of the film's life, right?
Yeah, and she had just the right tonal sensibility. It's got a 70s feel. It's a tiny bit Schoolhouse Rock. It's just the right touch in terms of storytelling and visual pop. And we really feel she elevated the film in a big way.
And we, you didn't ask about fundraising, but we pieced the funding together from, like, NEH was the biggest funder.
The National Endowment for the Humanities.
Yeah. And then we got smaller grants from Ohio Humanities, Massachusetts Humanities. We sort of pieced it together. There's no
broadcaster involved at the time. We're very thrilled that the film's going to have a big life out there in 2021. We can't say where yet, but we're very
But we know.
But we know, and we can say that after this weird year of online festivals, the film will have a big, long life out there in the world, which is great. We look forward to being able to talk about it.
And we're getting paid for them.
That's awesome. That's great. Well, I want to just touch on one thing you just said before we wrap it up, which is the idea of how you realize that things that inherently, and that maybe 20 years ago people would have known inherently about unions or about something else, what it's like when you discover that people don't know the thing that you think, I don't even have to explain this because everyone's going to get this part of it.
Or like the women's movement even.
Yeah.
The women's
how do you approach that? Because I mean, I just made a film about something that happened 22 years ago, and it was shocking to me how many times I had to be like, well, I don't have to explain that. And I was like, oh no, I have to explain a little bit of that because people don't,
Right.
People,
it's tough though. It's tough because you don't want it to become something like, 101 for the subject matter, because then you lose the audience who already knows, right? So you've got to, it's a fine line of like bringing something up, referring to it, slight bit of exposition, but not too much that you bog it down. And that's, I mean, I feel like all that stuff, whether it's from an interview, from archival, from whatever, text on screen, it's a pendulum. You over-explain, and then you under-explain, and then you over-explain, and you finally find that like right sweet spot where it's elegant, but not over-explaining.
And graphics really helps.
Yeah.
Graphics, you can speed things along and condense, but also the way the world has gone helped a bit. The fact that we now do have Me Too, we do have, people have talked openly about sexual harassment, and people are in jail because of it.
Yeah.
Think about it, 7 or 8 years ago.
Yeah.
If the film had come out like kind of on schedule after 3 years or something, we would have had to explain a lot more.
Yeah.
The Fight for 15. People know what that's about now. And I think unions even, I feel pretty sure that unions are more in the popular mind a positive thing. I mean, you have people who work tech at Amazon or who do special effects in movies asking to be unionized.
Well, and look, I mean, right now in California, right, Lyft and Uber drivers, they're actual employees, and yet their companies say they're not. Oh, no, they're all independent contractors, so we don't have to pay them benefits or anything like that.
Yeah.
This consciousness that the world has not gone in the direction of helping people have decent lives. Most of us who work jobs, I mean, we're lucky we get to make movies, but so many millions of people just want to have a decent life, and they're ready to work hard for it, but that they shouldn't be ripped off left and right by their companies. It's just the world doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah, things have really gone down for American workers, down, and you see that in American Factory. You see that first in the last truck. It wasn't just one plant that closed, one auto plant. There were others, and lots of plants were closing. I mean, my own background as a working class kid, my dad was a union man. A third of workers were at that point. So growing up, it's like we never worried about losing our house or the electric being turned off, or were we ever going to get a vacation? We had a secure life. I always say we didn't have books and pictures in our house. We were not educated people, but we were secure. And that sense of security for most American workers is pretty much out the window. I mean, just regular workers is pretty much out the window. And you see that between sort of union maids when they fought to build the union movement, to like the last truck where the union's not even helping them. The union can't help them. And then they fight for a union and everybody in American Factory, and they all get fired. And the roots of the anti-union, those companies, like you see in American Factory, right?
Union avoidance.
The union avoidance companies. We first heard about that when we were making 9 to 5, because that all started in the late 70s, early 80s with Reagan and the rise of the Christian right. So that's what I mean. These things all kind of come together to me, So I feel like if you look at all these films, all these historic, well, both verite and historic, they kind of weave a picture of work. I guess that's where we started, of like working class and women's lives in the 20th and 21st century. Whoa.
Amazing. Well, one last question before we go, which is, we're recording this before the election. So people are watching it after the election, so they know more than we do.
Oh God.
We don't know what the storylines of the election will be.
Right.
But certainly from the last presidential election, one of the storylines was what was happening in states like Ohio, what was happening across the Rust Belt. You know, and I'm curious, you know, you guys are based in Ohio. You don't just make films about Ohio, but you are able to look around you and say, hey, there's a story going on right next to me. And so whether you want to relate it to our current politics or the current story of America or not, what does it mean to you to be filmmakers who are based where you're based and to tell the stories that you're telling at this moment in time?
We love it. I feel very lucky to be where we are and to have a community that understands and supports us, and to just have, I don't know, I feel just, I look out and I'm so happy to be looking at trees and a small town, and I don't know. I feel we're very lucky.
No, we're incredibly lucky. At the same time, you know, we drive any direction and we're surrounded by Trump signs, and we are not supporters of the current president. And you know, it's a weird environment. We try to talk to people and try to understand where people are coming from and not prejudge it. It's hard. It can be confounding and maddening, but it's, you know, we try to do it.
You also feel like, you know, sometimes like the micro is macro, you know, that idea. You can make a film about one factory and it turns out it's a global film, or it's what's happening there is, and you don't know that, but I don't feel we have to go fly somewhere to find an important story, you know?
Right.
We can just, we want to work, we want to get our car, throw the camera in the back, throw the sound here, and go find, you know, document something.
Yeah.
You know, one of the, I don't know if this is before or after, but I'll just throw this in and you can cut it out. We have another film showing called 846. It's a short, and talk about a story happening in your own hometown. You know, that film 846, which is Dave Chappelle's, you know, plea to the world to like pay attention to what happened with George Floyd and his own reaction. And what does it mean to crush somebody's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds? Took place like 2 miles from our house. You know, like that's a way in which we're lucky.
Yeah.
Does that make sense to talk about that?
Yeah. I mean, it's playing here at the St. Louis Film Festival, and I think it's streaming like the entire time.
I don't know.
No, we're very proud of that film too. You know, that's a documentary short, but we made it with Dave Chappelle. And it feels like it tried to really address the moment that we're in. Yeah.
Well, yeah, go find that film if you're attending the festival virtually this year. My friends, the Academy Award-winning filmmakers, Steven Bognar and Julia Reichert, much love to both of you.